You're now watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie. So it's come to my attention that I never actually finished my Spider-Man movie retrospective reviews. Now, that's largely due to the fact that I'm a professional procrastinator, and I will wait till the last minute to do literally everything. So this series was already way behind schedule. But, to be fair to myself, another major contributing factor in me just not finishing this project is because after watching Spider-Man Far From Home, I just didn't feel like talking about Spider-Man on film anymore. I'm not trying to be melodramatic here, but that movie really crushed your boy's feelings. But at this point, given how that movie came out, a year ago? I've gotten over it. And I'm back now, and I'm ready to talk about Spider-Man some more. So, we're finally at the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, aka the best live-action representation of the character. Yeah, I said it. Bite me. Actually, please don't bite me. I'm pretty sure that's how you get hepatitis. But yeah, right out the gate, I love this movie. And I feel like up until this point, up until 2012, this is the second best representation of the character of Peter Parker and the world of Spider-Man, coming behind the Spectacular Spider-Man animated series. Now, don't get me wrong. This movie has flaws. A lot of flaws. But I don't think it's nowhere near as bad as a lot of people like to make it out to be. And in fact, I don't think it's bad at all. I actually think the positive outweighs the negative to the point where it balances out as an above-average superhero movie. And yes, that is the standard we're setting with these Spider-Man movies. And yes, that is very, very sad. And the tragedy of this film is that it's a slightly above-average superhero movie that had the potential to be one of the greatest superhero films of all time, but just falls short. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the retrospective. And as always, talking about the characters and where they come from and what their motivations are and blah 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 blah. We're going to start off with the title character of Peter Parker, portrayed in this reboot by Andrew Garfield. And I think he's brilliant. In fact, I'd go as far to say that out of everyone who's played the character in live action, Andrew Garfield is the closest to what Steve Ditko and Stan Lee were going for in the original 60s Amazing Spider-Man comics. He's kind of broody. He keeps to himself. He kind of has a problem with authority, and despite his shy, introverted demeanor, he has a sharp tongue and isn't afraid to give people a piece of his mind, even if they are Flash Thompson. And I've seen a lot of people complain that he's too good looking, and that he rides a skateboard, which makes him too cool. And I don't mean to be rude or put anyone else's opinion down when I say this, but those arguments are fucking stupid and the definition of superficial. Because, and this is just a matter of social interaction and the way people interact with each other in high school, it doesn't matter how you look or how you dress or what your hobby is. If you're an introverted, quick-tempered weirdo who struggles to maintain a simple conversation without nervously jittering about and stumbling over each syllable like a meth head with fetal alcohol syndrome, then nobody, and I mean nobody, will want to have anything to do with you. Seriously, trust me on that. I know what I'm talking about. And I feel like this movie deserves a lot of praise for actually giving the character of Peter Parker a lot of nuance in that regard. Well, to be honest, this film gets a lot of credit from me personally for actually making Peter Parker a character at all, because unlike the Tobey Maguire Peter Parker, I feel like I understand who this Peter Parker is as a person, Everything in his background informs something about his character, his personality, his decision-making, all that stuff. He has mommy and daddy abandonment issues, which is why he's afraid to get close to people, because he's afraid of them leaving him, which is part of the reason why he keeps to himself. But since he doesn't open up to a lot of people very often, when he finally does allow himself to do so, the full range of his unfiltered emotion comes pouring out like a flood, but everything is jumbled and confused because he doesn't regularly articulate what's going on in his head or in his heart, which is why he's constantly stumbling over his words. Or in certain situations where he does let his temper get the better of him, he acts irrationally and makes impulsive mistakes or says the last thing that he should have said in moments of high tension when he feels attacked. And that's something that really tracks with his character, because this is a Peter Parker who's very quick-tempered and hyper-reactionary. Hell, the first thing he does when he's on his journey to becoming Spider-Man, he's doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. He's beating up the bad guys, and he's beating up these muggers, and he's beating up these rapists because they all fit a profile? And he's very clearly out for revenge after his Uncle Ben's murder. So, in other words, he's written like an actual teenager. And he's performed like an actual teenager. Despite the fact that this nigga is clearly 30 with a white-collar career, a wife, 2 kids, and a credit score that's over 720. And that's just really refreshing, not just in a Spider-Man film, but on film in general. Because we don't get that a lot. Not the older actors playing teenagers bit, we actually get that quite a lot. I mean, having a nuanced teenage protagonist. And I also like how he grows as a character throughout the film. He makes mistakes that a teenager in his situation would make, but he also grows from them. And when Peter finally does become Spider-Man and is granted complete and total anonymity, we see him as he wants to be. We see him as the charismatic, fun-loving goofball with not a care in the world.
Just let me go.
Is that a knife? Is that a real knife?
Yes, it's a real knife.
My weakness, it's small knives.
Just let me go.
Anything but knives!
Oh, it's so simple.
And I think Andrew Garfield said it best where he compares Spider-Man to an internet troll. Because he's essentially wearing a gimp suit and you can't see who he is, Peter feels as though he can do anything and say anything and not get in trouble for it. And the film really plays with that idea, which I'll get to later, but I really appreciate how, again, unlike the Maguire Peter Parker Spider-Man dynamic, this one feels natural. And on top of that, I like how Peter actually has a character arc in this film, more importantly, one directly relating to power and responsibility. It's almost as if one of the 8 million writers of this movie understood the character and wanted to tell a Spider-Man story. And it's just a relief to finally have a live-action Peter Parker that feels like a three-dimensional character as opposed to a nerdy cardboard cutout like he was in the previous franchise. Oh, and quick sidebar here, I actually really like the idea of Peter Parker using a skateboard. Not only is it a nice visual metaphor that gives the audience a subconscious cue for his anti-authority attitude, but it also gives the character an inspiration to use the city as his personal urban playground. And yeah, I'm totally not biased because I ride a skateboard myself. Then we have Gwen Stacy, played by the wonderful and talented Emma Stone, and on paper, I should hate this character. Like, I really should. She is the perfect girlfriend. She's a freaking 3D nerd waifu. Everything Peter can do intellectually, she can do better. And I shouldn't like this character, but I do. In fact, I'm going to go as far to say that this is my favorite version of Gwen Stacy ever. Which is weird because her character is approached in the exact same way it's been in the comics for the past 20 odd years. And I absolutely, unequivocally hate it there. Because in the comics, she's depicted as this patron saint who was a brilliant scientist, despite the fact that in the comics she wasn't a brilliant scientist, nor was she Peter's one true love. If anything, she was just one of the chicks that Peter hung out with in college, who was more of a tsundere type love interest more than anything else. But the difference between the comics and this movie is that here, Gwen's seeming perfect science waifu, I'm smart and I know that I'm smart and I know that you know that I'm smart characterization is played as a character flaw. Because at the end of the day, the movie knows that she's still a teenager. And as brilliant as she is for her age, there's still a lot of growing up for her to do. And she has to be reminded of that every so often, mainly by her father, Police Captain George Stacy, which I really appreciate because immediately that gives Gwen a parallel with Peter, who's searching for a father figure, whereas she's always had one. And the more that I think about it, the more that I feel like Gwen in this movie is almost portrayed like the ideal version of Peter. One who didn't grow up with a lot of emotional baggage and the hang-ups of having parental abandonment issues, and focused on their work and was confident in their abilities. But because of that upbringing and growing up in what basically equates to an ivory tower, which I really like that as a visual metaphor because it explains why these characters see the world differently, with Gwen looking down on the world from on high and Peter looking up because he grew up in a house on the ground. Wait, where was I? Wait, I had a point I was going with. Wait, where was I? Oh, right. But because of her upbringing, there's a bit of a follow the rules style naivete to her that's really endearing. One that she's forced to overcome once she finds out that her boyfriend is the vigilante Spider-Man, who's legally doing a lot of the wrong things for the right reasons. There's also an interesting Freudian complex at play with Gwen, where she finds herself attracted to Peter, who shares a lot of the same traits as her father. Chief among them, his willingness to put the lives of others above his own. And she even addresses that in the film when Peter crawls into her room half dead, covered in blood and bruises, after doing what he could to make the city a safer place. Also, this film does something that I really want to praise it for, and it's that this is the first Spider-Man film where the love interest is actually a decent human being, despite having some very human and very believable flaws. But like I said in the other retrospectives, the bar's not really all that high. And all around, she's just a joy to watch, and most of that is down to Emma Stone's immaculate performance, and I would argue that this is the definitive version of Gwen Stacy across all media. Next up, we have Dr. Curtis Connors, played by Rhys Ifans, and for me, as much as I like Ifans' performance, character-wise, he's the weakest link in the film. And he's not bad, he's just not as good as I think he could have been. Now, my big issue with him is that not only does he lack a compelling motivation, but the motivation that he does have and the way in which he goes about acting on it feels like it tonally clashes with the nuanced, grounded tone that this film ultimately has, and would have worked better in one of the Raimi films. Which is probably because one of the key writers on this film, Alvin Sarnat, wrote the first two Spider-Man films and was instrumental in crafting the third. Connors is a geneticist who studies limb replacement and cellular regeneration, but we're never told why. And I guess the obvious answer is that he's missing a limb himself and wants it back. But we're never told how he loses his arm, or even if he had one in the first place. He's just hell-bent on growing one because plot. And once he infects himself with the lizard formula and becomes the lizard, he has this weird compulsion to turn everyone in the city into lizards because he feels as though he's unlocked the true human potential. I think. And that's another thing. Connors will say things, but never fully communicate what he's getting at or why he's doing what he's doing. And while that's not necessarily a problem in general, it's a problem when that's done in this film in particular, because there are characters who communicate their actions and their motivations, and when a pivotal character in a story such as this doesn't do that, it's glaring and it feels kind of weak overall. Which is why I think that one of the film's biggest mistakes was cutting Connors' family from the film. I feel like giving Connors a human anchor in his wife and his son would have given us a more well-rounded idea of who Curt Connors was as a man and not just as a scientist. Also, a scene where he tries to play with Billy and suffers from some sort of phantom limb syndrome wouldn't have hurt either, probably giving him more incentive to test the lizard formula out on himself. Not to say that I don't like the idea of him testing it out on himself to spare people from being experimented on by Oscorp, which Osborn and his lackey Nels Van Adder threatened to do, but something relating to his personal life and his family would have really given his actions and motivations more weight. On a more positive note, I do appreciate the power and responsibility parallel that this film is doing with Peter, where Connors feels as though he's made this grand discovery and he feels like it's his responsibility to cure humanity of any and all defects, since that's what he's done to himself. I also think that Rhys Ifans delivers a great performance, both as Connors and as the Lizard. And some people have criticized his version of the Lizard for being too over the top, but I don't know, I kind of liked it. I felt like it was appropriate, especially since Connors is shown to be a very reserved, calm gentleman, when he transforms into the Lizard, he parades himself as this larger-than-life powerhouse, which is similar to how when Peter becomes Spider-Man, he goes from being a shy introvert to being a wisecracking, lively goofball. Captain George Stacy is also in the film, played by Dennis O'Leary, and I think that he does a really good job in the role. And I appreciate how, given the tone and the subject matter of this film, Captain Stacy fills the J. Jonah Jameson role of being the authoritative figure in opposition to Spider-Man, with him being a cop and Spider-Man being played as the lawless vigilante. And I like that he's never played as being a fool, despite that being the obvious thing to do in this film. Because Captain Stacy presents very valid, reasonable counter-arguments to Spider-Man's presence in the city. Like I said, when Peter first becomes Spider-Man, he's not only doing the right things for the wrong reasons, it's very apparent that he's only bringing in criminals who fit a set profile, and is not only on a revenge quest, but is disrupting complicated police operations because he's not looking at the bigger picture. Spider-Man is looking at the world like a kid, because, well, he is a kid. I also like Stacy's relationship with Peter.
Hey, nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you. Dinner's ready. Hope you like Branzino.
Who doesn't?
He's obviously doing the overprotective father bit, and despite being a little unnerved that his little girl's boyfriend has a few screws loose, he recognizes that Pete ultimately has a heart of gold. The scene that best illustrates this is when Peter immediately rushes from school to alert the police about Connors being the Lizard, and even after Stacy kicks him out of the precinct because, from where he's standing, Peter's rambling about his daughter's internship mentor being some 9-foot-tall dinosaur, and making an absolute fool of himself, he trusts Peter, and he asks for one of his men to pull up a file on Connors. Which is why, when he realizes that Peter and Spider-Man are one and the same, he doesn't hesitate to help him when stopping Connors from wreaking havoc on the city. And last but not least, also featured in this film are Aunt May and Uncle Ben, portrayed by Sally Field and Martin Sheen. And I think they're absolutely fantastic in this movie. You know, not to take anything away from Rosemary Harris and the late, great Cliff Robinson, this Aunt May and Uncle Ben feel more like people, as opposed to inspirational speech generators. They actually feel like adoptive parents. You know, even down to when they're disciplining Peter, it feels like they're a realistic, relatively older couple who are doing their best to raise a kid who they love unconditionally, despite not fully understanding him. I know that a lot of people like to compare this version of Aunt May and Uncle Ben to their Ultimate Universe counterparts, but I just don't get that vibe from them at all. For me, they feel like slightly younger interpretations of their classic Earth 616 counterparts. The only out that I'll give this argument is that in regards to Aunt May, since traditionally in the comics she doesn't tend to kirk on Peter, that I'm aware of, whereas in the Ultimate Universe, her and Peter get into it quite a bit. You know, not in a toxic way, but more so in a fairly average single mother raising a teenager kind of way. Which does happen in this movie, and those scenes are beautifully acted between Andrew Garfield and Sally Field. Particularly the I Can't Sleep scene, where Aunt May catches Peter sneaking back into the house late at night, and I appreciate that because it shows that Peter isn't the only one dealing with the loss of Uncle Ben. You know, Aunt May can't bring herself to go to bed, let alone sleep at night. And to make matters worse, her nephew's going out doing God knows what, coming home in the middle of the night with black eyes, bruises, and bloodied knuckles. And she's absolutely horrified because her life is being turned upside down so fast. Now, I will say that this film makes the same mistake as Spider-Man 2, where it's all but telegraphed that Aunt May knows that Peter is Spider-Man, and the next film kinda just drops that idea completely. But I've always read that gag at the end of the movie where Peter comes home bloodied and battered while holding the eggs that he promised to get earlier in the film as a silent contract that she knew, but wasn't gonna say anything. Kind of like when your mom knows why you take so long in the bathroom, and you know that she knows why you take so long in the bathroom, but neither one of you wants to address it. Because we all went through that, right? Right? Guys? As for Ben, God, I love Martin Sheen's Uncle Ben. He's such a down-to-earth guy, and even though he's cut from a totally different cloth from Peter, the love that these two share is clear and unconditional. It's actually quite infectious, which makes it all the more heartbreaking when he dies. And that's something else that I'll cite as a clear-cut improvement over the last franchise. And what makes it worse is that he dies doing the right thing. He tries to do what Peter should have done, which later sets the example for what he'll ultimately become, and I really don't think that that should be overlooked. As far as the plot goes, well, okay, this is when the movie actually breaks down. Because this film's plot is about as weak as its characters are strong, and its characters are very, 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 very strong. And the main problem that this movie has is an identity crisis. Tone-wise, it doesn't know if it wants to be a grounded 500 Days of Summer meets superhero coming-of-age type movie, or if it wants to be Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3.5. And it's a problem that's seen all throughout the film, but made especially glaring in the third act with the lizard plot. So, this film is an origin story, to which a lot of people were firmly against from the get-go since, according to the internet, we'd already gotten a Spider-Man origin story 10 years prior. However, this is where I'll disagree, because while we did see the origin of Spider-Man in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, that film is in no way an origin film. However, The Amazing Spider-Man is. Throughout the entire film, we're watching Peter grow, change, and even sometimes regress, because that's what teenagers do. Hell, better yet, that's what people do. But okay, let me actually break down the plot for you guys. So, the film opens with a 6-year-old Peter Parker playing hide-and-seek with his parents, only to stumble upon his father's home office after it's been broken into. And after seeing the carnage, Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker, erase a bunch of data from the chalkboard, including this equation, which is later referred to as the decay rate algorithm. Then they gather as much as they possibly can before dropping Peter off at Aunt May and Uncle Ben's. And I love this opening because it's dramatic, and it's very different from what we've seen in previous Spider-Man movies. Plus, it informs the character of Peter Parker. The last shot that we see of young Peter is him watching his parents leave him behind, and the next transition shot is of him blankly staring into a reflective glass as a teenager some 10 or 11 years later. In a lot of ways, he's still that kid longing for his parents to come home. And because they never did, he has a lot of abandonment issues, which ultimately lead to problems connecting with those in his surroundings. It's almost like the writers of this film understand how people work. But now I'm just being repetitive. Anyways, we see some of Peter's high school life. We see that he's awkward around people, he skateboards in the hallway, and then when he's told not to, he does it anyways, because he has a certain disdain for authority. But he's also kind of a creep and takes pictures of girls that he likes. And, yeah, that's not okay. But I guess he gets a pass since he has a heart of gold and he's willing to stand up for people when they're in trouble. Like when he stands up to Flash Thompson despite knowing that he'd be walking into a losing battle, only to be rescued by the love interest of the film, Gwen Stacy, who handles the situation with a sense of diplomacy. And after collecting his pride from the asphalt, Peter makes his way to class, where he's both scolded and praised by Gwen for his brave yet stupid behavior. And this opening is perfect because it tells us everything we need to know about these characters in the span of like 5 minutes. Anyways, after Peter gets home from school, he hangs out with Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and we get to see their incredibly mundane family dynamic in what appears to be an average day for them, which is really appreciated considering how their lives get riggedy wrecked soon afterwards. And while helping Uncle Ben with a leak in their basement, Peter stumbles upon his father's briefcase, and like any curious teenager with mommy and daddy abandonment issues, he's eager to look through his dad's old stuff. Now, it is insanely convenient that he would discover the secret compartment in his dad's briefcase, giving him access to a bunch of super secret files, including the decay rate algorithm, which is necessary information for leading him to Oscorp, which then progresses the film's plot. But I chalk that up to Peter having an established knowledge of his dad having secret compartments for his stuff, since he sees his dad opening a drawer in the opening of the film. God, that was so hard to say. Or maybe I'm just reaching. I don't fucking know, man. It worked for me. This is also where we get the scene where Peter tells Uncle Ben that he's a pretty great dad, and oh my god, you don't understand. I really, really don't want Uncle Ben to die, despite this movie being 8 years old, and knowing full goddamn well that he gets the $2 special. Anyways, after Uncle Ben tells Peter about Dr. Curtis Connors, he does some research on his parents and finds out that there might be a connection between their deaths and Oscorp, the company they worked for, and heads to Oscorp to meet with Dr. Connors to get some answers. But after sneaking into the building, he runs into the typical Parker luck where he finds that Gwen Stacy from his school is working for the company that has ties to his parents' disappearance. But after making an impression on Dr. Connors and getting chewed out by Gwen for being somewhere where he's not supposed to be, he once again sneaks off, finds a hidden room full of spiders, gets bitten by one of them, and gets his molecules rearranged like his name is Danny Phantom. Meanwhile, Dr. Connors is being rushed by his superiors at Oscorp to develop a cure for Norman Osborn, who is apparently dying, and this is where the film really starts to pick up the pace, because after this, Peter begins experimenting with his powers while freaking out his Aunt May and Uncle Ben in the process, which I thought was pretty funny. And in his efforts to get to the bottom of what's happening to him, Peter consults Dr. Connors, and after giving him the decay rate algorithm, Connors offers to take Peter under his wings. Or, wing. And this is the point of the film where Peter starts to shirk his responsibilities in favor of living out his greatest fantasies. He's working with big-time scientists. He has the physical power to break Flash Thompson's ego, and all of this gives him that extra nudge to ask the girl of his dreams out on a date. But it's not without consequence. And if I may, I'm gonna derail this video by saying, this is how you tell that story. This is how you tell that story. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Because after blowing off Uncle Ben's phone calls, he catches hell for not picking up Aunt May from the subway station, and this is where we get the power responsibility speech, which is almost verbatim what it is in Bendis and Bagley's Ultimate Spider-Man, which I like on multiple levels. One, because I'm a fanboy, and two, because it feels a little more naturalistic than saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And that's what this movie, or at the very least this section of the film, is. It's a more naturalistic take on the Spider-Man mythology. And after this, Peter storms off, and after a run-in with a store clerk named T-Bone, literally his name is T-Bone. I'm not sure if that's a reference to anything in the comics, or if that's just a New York thing. He gives Peter some shit about not having exact change to buy his chocolate milk, which is definitely a New York thing. And when Peter's walking away, this robber steals a bunch of money from the clerk as Peter watches and chooses to do nothing. Hell, the robber even tosses Peter his chocolate milk, and after T-Bone asks him for help, Peter blows him off out of some petty sense of spite. And it's that spite that gets Uncle Ben killed, because after the robber runs away, he runs into Uncle Ben, who steps up to the plate and tries to protect his neighborhood, and dies trying. And the blood is on Peter's hands. Literally, Uncle Ben's blood is on Peter's hands. I know that some people who are smarter than me will complain that it's a little too on the nose, but I don't care. I like the visual metaphor. Plus, can I just say that I really like that Uncle Ben dies over something as trivial as chocolate milk, because it makes Peter's inaction and refusal to help all the more petty. So when Uncle Ben is killed for it, the guilt that Peter feels is all the more pressing. Yeah, sure, he stuck it to T-Bone by telling him to fuck off, and he got his chocolate milk in the process, but the consequences he suffers for it are immediate and drastic, only adding to Peter's unbridled rage. Not just at the man who killed his Uncle Ben, but at himself. And this is the point in the film where Peter's anger consumes him, and he starts to go on a manhunt for his uncle's killer, and becomes Spider-Man. And while he does have a violent outlet for his anger, it's not only putting him at odds with the police, it's also leaving a negative impact on his home life as well as his school life. He emotionally distances himself from everyone at school. He even snaps at Flash Thompson, who's trying to console him, and his aunt is beyond worried about his erratic behavior. And I know that this is a point of contention between a lot of people, but I fall into the camp who really likes the idea of Spider-Man starting out as an unhealthy outlet for Peter's aggression. Meanwhile, Dr. Connors is being put under a lot more intense pressure to come up with a cure for Norman Osborn, and it's here where he's delivered an ultimatum. He can either fast-track human trials, or he can suffer the same fate as Richard Parker. After that, Peter is invited to dinner by Gwen Stacy, and God, I love everything about this scene. So, this is where Peter meets Captain George Stacy, and there's this uncomfortable argument that they have about Spider-Man where Peter defends Spider-Man's actions, hailing him as a hero, whereas Captain Stacy is on the opposite end of the argument. And he puts Peter in his place, and he tells him that Spider-Man isn't being a hero, and anyone who thinks that he is looking at the world like a kid. You know, he's a reckless vigilante who's profiling criminals in order to set a personal score with somebody. And this is where the wheels start turning, and Peter begins to reevaluate what Spider-Man is and should be. However, the dinner is cut short by an emergency on the Manhattan Bridge, because not too long earlier, Dr. Connors, being the morally upstanding man that he is, decided that if any of his research was going to go to human trials, he may as well go ahead of Oscorp and test the serum on himself. Which he does, in a brilliant and beautiful scene where he's grown his arm back, and it looks fleshy and moist, and actually, the more I describe it, it's kind of gross. But not gross, it's like childbirth. It's gross in a beautiful kind of way. But the serum starts to change Connors, transforming him into the Lizard, who's now on a warpath to kill his boss, putting dozens of other people's lives in danger in the process. Luckily, just as Captain Stacy makes his way to the scene, Peter follows, but not before telling Gwen his secret, which I still think is the dumbest thing that Peter could have done in that moment, but it's consistent with his character, and like all of his actions in this film, there are consequences. Anyways, Peter fights the Lizard on the bridge and rescues civilians in the battle, giving us one of my favorite scenes in any superhero movie. And it's the scene where Peter's trying to save a kid from a burning car, and he tells him to put on his mask, because it's gonna make him feel strong. And I don't know, man, just as a Spider-Man fan, and as a kid who grew up reading and loving Spider-Man, I can't tell you how much that scene means to me, and what it does to me on a personal level. It's really magic. But after this, we get the scene where Peter decides what he wants to represent as Spider-Man. And this is why, for the life of me, I don't understand how people can just say that after this, Peter just forgets about Uncle Ben's killer. He doesn't. And that's why I think a lot of people didn't pay attention to the dinner scene and the bridge scene. Because after those two experiences, Peter continues to be Spider-Man, but the mission has changed. You know, he no longer wants to be a vigilante hiding in the shadows consumed by vengeance. He wants to be a protector. And part of that is letting go of a vendetta. And from here, the film kind of blazes along while changing the tone drastically. Because at this point, Peter goes to hunt down the Lizard because he's a threat to the city. But in order to do so, he needs to find Dr. Connors for advice. But quickly figures out that Connors himself is the Lizard. And after failing to convince Captain Stacy of this, Peter sets out to do it on his own, while getting his shit kicked in by the Lizard in the process. We also find out that Connors has gone completely insane, and now wants to turn the entire city into lizards. And, okay, I'll talk about that in a minute, but I don't have a problem with the overall concept, but much rather the execution of it all. Anyways, Connors figures out that Peter is Spider-Man because he gets a hold of Peter's camera, which has his name on it, because this version of Peter Parker is really, really dumb. But again, I like some of the stupid mistakes that he makes, because all of the mistakes that he makes in this movie are mistakes that a dumb teenager who's trying to play superhero would make. And not too long afterwards, Connors attacks Midtown High in what is my personal second favorite fight sequence in any of these Spider-Man movies. But that's mostly because it's basically an adaptation of the Green Goblin fight scene from the first arc of Ultimate Spider-Man, but I'll talk about fight scenes in just a minute. Anyways, the Lizard escapes and Peter follows him to the sewers, where he stumbles upon the Lizard's laboratory, and figuring out his Grandmaster plan to turn New York City into lizard people using a missile to launch an airborne virus. And, okay, so here's my beef. So up until this point, the movie's been fairly grounded and intimate, and the whole Gennady device concept really throws a wrench into that. Also, this is why I think cutting Connor's family from the film was a huge mistake, because with this film's family motif and themes of responsibility and doing what you can for your family, I feel like this film missed an opportunity to show Connor's experimenting on his family, just to show how far gone he truly is. Or, something like that. Also, I think that making this movie a missing persons kind of film would have worked really well too, and make it so that Connors is experimenting on random people, and maybe have the obligatory climactic battle take place in the New York City subway, or the sewers, or the reservoir in Central Park. Or at least I think that's a reservoir, I don't know, I'm not a New Yorker. But just something with low stakes, Instead, we get the climax of a Michael Bay movie that takes place at the top of Oscorp Tower, and it's just too goofy for this kind of movie. Again, if this were to happen in one of the Raimi films, that would have been just fine. But this film is so stylistically different from Raimi's Spider-Man, it's very distracting when the film shifts gears like that. And finally, there's the whole "keep Gwen out of it" line, which is later followed up on with Peter seemingly breaking that promise. And I know that a lot of people have serious issues with that, but here's the thing. I think the situation here is very complicated, and realistically way more money than I think people are comfortable with. So, Captain Stacy dies trying to help Peter stop the lizard, right? And his last request is for Peter to stop seeing Gwen. However, Peter is now in a tough situation because, while he loves Gwen, he also made a promise to Captain Stacy that he would leave her alone, and that was his dying request. But he also doesn't want Gwen to resent her dead father because she knows what his request was. And it's just a really shitty situation all around, one that I think was wonderfully followed up on in the sequel, especially given who the writers of that film are. As far as the visual effects goes, it's kind of a mixed bag, but in a world where this and this exist, I'd say that this film's special effects have aged way better than some other comic book films. And I gotta say, I really appreciate this movie's reliance on practical effects as much as possible, because the only scenes that look like they were generated completely in a computer are the scenes where Spider-Man is fighting an 8-foot-tall dinosaur man and propelling himself through the streets of New York, and even then, the CG in this film, as noticeable as it is, doesn't bother me so much, because it complements the way that this film is lit and photographed. And I gotta say, for Marc Webb's first action movie, I think he does a really goddamn good job. The transition from CG to practical effects and stuntmen is damn near flawless. The fight sequences in this film are beautiful. Like I mentioned previously, there were action scenes that are ripped directly out of the comics, and I really appreciate that as a fan. Plus, they're just so goddamn pretty. Again, the fight scene at Midtown High is basically ripped from the early pages of Ultimate Spider-Man, and the battle in the sewers is almost page for page, panel for panel, Spider-Man Torment. Not that that's a good comic at all, but it was still really cool to see that what I consider iconic Todd McFarlane imagery adapted to screen. And I know that I'm in the minority here, as I am with the majority of my takes on this film, but I actually quite like the design of the lizard in this movie. And I mean, sure, it's not the one that people are most familiar with, where he has the big snout and the red eyes and the purple pants. And while I'll admit that I wasn't too fond of the lizard never wearing his signature lab coat, I gotta say, I don't mind it. Mainly because, in my latest viewing of the film, I kind of sort of saw the lizard not wearing clothes as a visual cue that Connors has completely rejected his humanity, thus, he's no longer bound to the human convention of pants. Either that or I'm just reaching too deep for things. Plus, I never got why people were so insistent on him having a snout. First of all, Marc Webb made it a point that it was a more practical choice so that he wouldn't look weird when talking. Plus, in the lizard's first appearance, he doesn't have a snout. That's a design that came much later on. And since this movie feels very Ditko inspired, I kind of like that they stuck with a more traditional Ditko design for the lizard. Also, can we just take a moment to applaud them for daring to have scenes where Spider-Man is actually swinging through the set? Because that's hella dangerous, and that's hella bold, and I like it a lot.
Action!
Perfection.
Plus, the action sequences in this film are gorgeous. They not only feel like Spider-Man comics put to screen, they feel like 90s comics put to screen. Visually, when this film is not being a Steve Ditko comic, it gives off some strong Todd McFarlane vibes. Even in the way Garfield poses in the suit, it feels like he was ripped straight from the cover of Spider-Man #1 or Amazing Spider-Man 300. And speaking of, let's talk about the suit. I quite like it. Well, now I do at least. I can't really say the same back in 2011 when we got our first glimpse of it, because much like the Spider-Man PS4 costume, my initial reaction to this suit was,
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
but much like the PS4 Spider-Man costume, I've grown to appreciate it for what it is within the context of the piece. And I gotta say, while I appreciate the effort to make it appear more homemade, it doesn't. If anything, the suit looks even more complicated than the classic suit. Plus, it only adds to this misconception that the Spider-Man costume is somehow impossible to make yourself. Like, I'm really glad that in more recent years, more prominent voices in the Spider-Man fanbase have debunked that myth, because why does everyone act like sewing is such a difficult task? It's really not. But I digress. That said, I do like that we get to at least see Peter making the suit, and I also really appreciate that he has mechanical web shooters in this film. I still think it's stupid that he gets his web fluid from Oscorp, but I like the design of the web shooters themselves and how they're made from old wristwatch parts. Oh, and shout out to whoever thought it was a good idea to dress Peter up like his character model from the Spectacular Spider-Man. Don't think that little detail went unnoticed or unappreciated. And finally, there's the score. And I think it's alright. Honestly, aside from the editing, I feel like this is one of the weakest parts of the movie. Because unlike the scores for the 3 Spider-Man films that come before this, and the 4 that follow, it kind of feels uninspired. Now don't get me wrong, there are certainly tracks that I really like from this, such as Young Peter and Promises, but everything in between just kind of feels meh. None of the music in the action scenes really feels dynamic or unique enough for this film, and for the most part, James Horner's score feels like you can throw it in the background of any coming-of-age action movie that came out between 2009 and 2015, and I think that's a real shame. All that said, I really like this movie. It is still my favorite live-action Spider-Man film, which is really quite depressing. Because this movie had the potential to be the best Spider-Man film ever made, with great performances, impeccable directing, a solid enough script, but ultimately the film is just short of perfection because of silly editing, and cutting characters that should have been in the film, and cutting scenes that just make the narrative flow better. But it is what it is. And for me, it's still the closest thing we're ever going to get to seeing an adaptation of Steve Ditko and Stan Lee era Spider-Man comics. And at this point, I'll take it. Anyways, what are your thoughts regarding this film? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you think that I'm a meth head for being as positive about this film as I am? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel. And if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.